The death penalty, otherwise known as capital punishment, is when a person is sentenced to death for committing a capital crime. Now the sentence we know as the death sentence, whereas the act is actually called execution. Capital punishment has been practiced in most societies, for a very long time. And as of now, 57 countries are practicing it, whereas over 90 of them have abolished it. Obviously something has changed. In ancient China, the death penalty can be traced back as far as to that point. Now in the 18th century, the codes of King Hammurabi of Babylon, they implemented the death penalty for over 25 different crimes, killing not being one of them. In 16th century Egypt, noblemen, they were forced to kill themselves for committing some kind of crime, whereas commoners were killed by axe. Obviously, the death penalty can be traced to many different facets of our timeline, and it's continued throughout history. So what's changed? Why are we now considering abolishing it? What happened between then and now that made us think that the death penalty for whatever crime is no longer okay? Today we are going to talk about various different aspects of the death penalty and focus in on this topic. We're going to look at it financially, politically, ethically, religiously, and internationally, and try and find some idea of where this change came from.
An important factor to consider when dealing with the death penalty is the financial aspect of it. The cost of the death penalty is paid for by taxpayers, and from arrest to conviction, it can cost $1 to $3 million per convict. And according to the Commission on Fair Administration of Justice, California alone spends $137 billion for the death penalty. This cost includes the pre-trial, the trial itself, and dealing with the appeals of the habeas corpus, along with the incarceration itself. In contrast, the annual cost for life without parole would have $170 million in savings.
Here in the United States, federal law applies the death penalty to certain crimes, and these include treason, espionage, murder, large-scale drug trafficking, and the attempt to kill witness, juror, a court officer in certain cases, along with the murder or attempted murder of members of Congress, members of the cabinet, and the Supreme Court justices. In any of these cases, the death penalty could be applied. Military law allows the execution of soldiers for several crimes, additionally. And executions by the federal government actually become pretty rare compared to the number of executions committed by state governments. In all, 26 executions have actually been carried out by the federal government since 1950. Only 26 in over 60 years. Now, of those executions and those committed to be executed, the Federal Bureau of Prisons manages the housing and execution of these federal death row prisoners. And as of March 13, 2012, 58 people are on the federal death row for men at the Federal Correction Complex in Indiana, along with 2 women on the federal death row at the Federal Medical Center in Fort Worth, Texas. That's just 60 people. In a nation of over 300 million, just 60 people are on the federal death row.
When we look at the death penalty on an international level, we notice that most of the countries in the world don't practice it anymore. They've abolished it. However, the top 4 most populated countries continue to use it, and that's where we see the difference. Most countries have abolished it, whereas most people still live in places that it's active, that it's practiced. Now, we look at the top 4, U.S. being one of them, China, India, Indonesia, and we can see the differences. U.S. mainly uses lethal injection, they use the gas chamber, and sometimes even firing squad. Whereas China, they keep their number of deaths and the way that they do it secret. It's been done by shooting and injection. We have no real conclusive facts on how many people China has killed, except for 2011, when they have estimated to maybe have killed over 4,000 people.
For thousands of years, people have been attempting to use religion in order to justify what they think is correct about the death penalty. Catholicism, in Catechism section 2267, says that the death penalty is usable, but clarifies very specifically how it can be used, and says that it cannot be used except for in the rarest of rare circumstances, and very specifically mentions that the times where it can be used is almost non-existent. Catholicism generally doesn't like to use it. Islam does purport for the death penalty, but has so under two very distinct reasons. First off, you can be executed for murder, and then you can also be executed for what they call spreading mischief amongst the land. Depending on your interpretation of this could be anything from treason to homosexual tendencies, depending on your interpretation. What's interesting to note is that here the Muslim community actually mentions what you could be executed for, and the victims are the final judges. The victim and or the victim's family have the final say in whether or not the accused gets executed.
Everyone thinks human life is valuable, no matter what side of the debate you're on. Many who are for capital punishment believe that there's nothing as valuable as human life aside from human life. Therefore, murder can only be repaid through retribution by capital punishment. Those for the death penalty believe that a person can, by their actions, forfeit human rights, and that murderers forfeit that right to live. Some argue that a person forfeits their life to live if they start a murderous attack, and the only way the victim can save their own life is by killing the attacker. The medieval philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas made this point very clearly in the words, "Therefore, if any man is dangerous to the community and is subverting it by some sin, the treatment to be commended is his execution in order to preserve the common good." Aquinas is basically saying that certain contexts change a bad act, like killing, into a good act, which is killing to repair the violation of justice done by the person killed, and killing a person who has forfeited their natural right to live. Now, those against capital punishment believe that human life is valuable in that same way, but they believe that it's so valuable that even the worst murderers should not be deprived of the value of their lives. They believe that the value of an offender's life cannot be destroyed by his bad conduct, even if they have killed someone.
There are many reasons why the death penalty is more expensive. For one, individuals on death row actually have to have one cell opposed to regular convicts who have to share a cell with other people. Another factor is that there are more lawyers and experts on both sides of the case, and this is because it's a very delicate life or death situation, so more people are required to be in the trial. And another factor is that there are 2 phases in the trial opposed to 1. So this requires more time, more jury selection, and ultimately it costs more to do this.
Now here in California, as of 2012, there are 725 offenders on the California death row, including 19 women. Of these, 126 have committed torture before murder, 173 have killed children, and 44 have murdered police officers. Now, since California became a state, 709 executions have been completed by our criminal justice system. Until 1972, when People versus Anderson was the case that was brought forward to the California Supreme Court, in which it was decided that the death penalty actually violated the state's constitution. Now that same year, Furman versus Georgia was brought to the United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court decided that executions in general violated the United States Constitution. And at that point, California decided no more death penalty, no more executions. Well, that lasted for about 6 years. In 1978, California reinstated the death penalty. But in 2006, the U.S. Judge Jeremy Fogel halted executions in California after finding flaws in the state's execution process. And the current hold on the death penalty and executions is pending judicial review of a new execution chamber and new methodologies for executing prisoners. Now, the moratorium that is currently on the death penalty is expected to continue through 2013 and possibly into 2014 before any resolution is found. There's currently battles between the inmate attorneys and the state attorney general. It may end up that these cases are brought to the California Supreme Court where a final decision is expected.
Think about the different kind of ethics that come from the different backgrounds that factor into the way that we enact such a harsh punishment. But should that mean that it's not okay to do it anymore? Now, America, people fight it often, but would it be different if we actually followed through with it? Would it be different financially? Would it be different in other places? China doesn't worry about that, obviously. They have a problem, someone breaks the law in an extreme way, and they end that person. So even though we can argue that most countries have abolished it, it doesn't matter. Because most people live their lives every day in a place where it does happen, where it's followed through. And that's really what we have to think about.
Many major Buddhist countries, such as Japan and Thailand, still have the death penalty. Experts attribute this to a kind of inability to cross over, where they worship as Buddhists, but don't carry that over into their everyday lives. Hinduism has no official stance, but very similar to Buddhism, does not approve of it. However, in many Hindu states, countries such as India, the death penalty is still used. The reason for this, some argue, is very similar to the reason that Buddhists do it, where there's a disconnect between the worshiping and actually living it in your everyday life.
Ultimately, those against the death penalty see it as a fallacy to teach society that it's wrong to kill by killing, especially when it's possible for innocent men and women to be put to death. They say that as a society we have to move away from the eye for an eye revenge mentality in order for civilization to progress and advance. Ultimately, it's a question of retribution versus the ultimate equality of every human life. And it's a decision that we each have to make as individuals and as a nation. Thank you.